Dave Smith has been building and pursuing a career in comedy for a decade or more. He has become a prominent fixture in comedy clubs and comedy festivals, and then began his own podcast, and as well as participating in a lot of other podcasts. And many of his own podcasts, such as Part of the Problem and Legion of Skanks, have been finding a very large audience, especially during the COVID pandemic, when so many people turned to online content because they couldn't go out. During that time, Dave Smith has also kept one foot very squarely in the world of politics, appearing on various political talk programs, and especially over the last couple of years has become a major fixture in our political discourse, appearing on some of the most popular online news shows, but also more establishment programs. I'm glad that he has been doing that, because I've been following Smith's work for some time and can say with certainty that his voice is a very productive addition to our often dreary political debates. It's often a fresh and enlivened way of explaining things. I was on his program a few months ago, and therefore, by the rules of online podcast etiquette, he is now forced to appear on mine. But whatever his motive for coming, we are very happy to have him here, and I want to say good evening to you, Dave. Welcome to your debut episode on System Update. I'm thrilled to have you.
Oh, thank you so much, Glenn. I'm really honored to be here, and as I told you when you were on my show, I've been a huge fan of yours, and your work has been enormously valuable to me, so I appreciate those very kind words.
Thanks. So we could obviously talk about a lot of the issues you and I have been talking about, the war in Israel and Gaza, the U.S. relationship to it, the war in Ukraine, and I think all of the ideas and arguments that you and I have, a lot of which we have in common, are very well heard. People have heard you say them and I say them, and a lot of other people say them a million times. So rather than just kind of be that repetitious, I want to talk about some of these issues in a little bit of a different way if I can, especially because I am interested in this participation that you have in the world of comedy, and the fact that you actually tried building your career and did build your career as a comic. And I don't know if you heard the beginning, but I was talking about how there's sort of this long history now of comedians having a very politicized content. A lot of famous comedians stayed far away from politics because they didn't want to anger people, but a lot of them didn't, like Lenny Bruce and George Carlin, two of the probably most brilliant and important comics of the 50s and 60s, were very political. Richard Pryor was. And then you had this kind of advent of Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert in the Bush administration, and it's hard to remember that then given who they are now, but they were incredibly innovative in what they were doing. I'm just in general interested in your view on why comedy, people who go to try and entertain others by being comics, often have this kind of connection to the political world. What is the relationship you've seen between the two?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and there's been lots of others, Mort Saul and all types of comedians who were always kind of groundbreaking in their political commentary. I remember, so when I was a kid, when I was around, I think 17, maybe 16, I got so if you could imagine the time, I was born in 1983, so this is in the late 90s. I got a TV VCR in my room, which to the younger viewers of the show may not know what I'm talking about.
I have no idea what a VCR is. I was far too young to have
You have no idea.
So please explain what that is for me and the others who don't know.
So let me explain. Okay, so a TV used to be connected to this thing called a VCR, Glenn, and that would play videotapes. I'll explain it to you later after the show. But there used to be one unit where you had both of them. And I didn't have cable or anything like that, but I had an antenna, and you could get basic television, which was like 5 or 6 networks at the time. And I on ABC, Channel 7 in New York, where I was at night was Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher. And I fell in love with that show. And, I was a kid, and it was a different time. This is pre 9/11 and stuff, but I just loved it. And I remember watching George Carlin come on the show and just school all of these people who were supposed to be experts in the field. And I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. And what you're talking about in that time, if people don't remember, during the George W. Bush administration, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert were just incredible. And there is something, I really agree with the point you made, where there's kind of this positive and negative about it. It's not the best sign for your society when comedians are the political commentators. In a much better world, I should be nowhere near any of these topics. However, when the kind of ruling elite have become so corrupt and so embarrassing and so pathetic that even a regular comedian can just absolutely destroy them and see through all of their nonsense. I do think that role becomes more necessary and more important. And there is something about, like the jester can only be the one who speaks the voice of truth when the king has become that tyrannical and that incompetent. And so I think that kind of speaks to the moment we're living in now and where we've been in America for quite a while. From my perspective, I'm just really fascinated with all of these ideas, and I've become obsessed with politics and history and economics and stuff like this. So I enjoy commentating on it. But it's a new world now where all of us have these shows on the internet that have a lot more people than many of the kind of corporate shows have. And so I really do enjoy this moment. I enjoy these conversations. And it's really cool for me that I get to, do shows like yours, shows that I'm a very big fan of.
Yeah, I often wonder whether, at least in the past, I'm not so sure it's true now in mainstream comedy. I want to get to the kind of devolution with these late night hosts who still do, quote, political commentary, but in the most banal and predictable and establishment pleasing way. But when it was done well, I often wondered whether that's because comedy or comedians is one job or one place where you're kind of permitted to transgress certain lines in the name of comedy. Whereas, especially now, and this is kind of the more recent emergence of the Rogan sphere and the like, as our political discourse has become more and more repressive, the lines for what you can't transgress are becoming more suffocating and more constrictive. Do you think that is a reason why there's so many times when these kind of political truths that so few people other than comics are willing to say find their way in comedy?
Well, okay, so let me say one thing on your comment about the mainstream. I think so. Michael Malice, who's a very good friend of mine, who's a just brilliant and hilarious, author and podcaster. He basically convinced me to stop using the term mainstream media. And I haven't used it since he made this argument. I thought I was just compelled that he was completely right. And I refer to them exclusively as the corporate press now, because even as you addressed earlier, I mean, look, think about Joe Rogan. Who's the mainstream? Is Brian Stelter the mainstream, or is Joe Rogan the mainstream? It kind of makes no sense to even call them that now. And so if you want to say mainstream, at the biggest comedians right now, the biggest comedians in the world, and particularly in the United States of America, are Joe Rogan and Shane Gillis and Bill Burr and, people who are very happy to mock and criticize kind of the establishment view. And so I think that actually the late night hosts like Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel, who, as you're absolutely right, are basically doing nothing but servicing power, I think they've been greatly diminished in status, and these other voices have been elevated. And so I think we're living in this kind of new world that we're all still figuring out now, but that there's definitely something different. Now, I think as something you've talked about a lot, right? And it's something I'm really fascinated by. It was like the first thing I think I asked you about when I was interviewing you on my show was like, hey, isn't it crazy that you are in this position where people view you as having gone through a transformation? Like, oh, you used to be this guy on the far left and now you're a guy on the far right. And really, your views haven't changed at all. Mm-hmm. And what's actually happening here is that there's been a transformation amongst other people, not really you. And so what I think is that in the George W. Bush years, there was a lot of freedom for comedians for a number of reasons. And a big part of that is that most comedians tend to exist in a liberal world. And George W. Bush was a Republican, and it was very easy to kind of oppose him, and not just because there weren't social ramifications for doing so, but also because he was so awful. And so that was, it was very easy to mock him as a comedian. Mocking George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, it's like, well, that's an easy task. Let's go do that. And then there was kind of this 1-2 punch of Barack Obama and then Donald Trump. And Barack Obama, because left liberals in general tend to have as the most deep-rooted fundamental part of their identity that they're the not racist ones. We're the ones who aren't bigots. And I think, given the history of the United States of America, there's an understandable reason why that would be such a important kind of fundamental value for liberals and leftists to have about themselves. And because Barack Obama was just so incredibly eloquent and talented as a public speaker, and because his 2008 campaign was, so beautiful in so many ways. I think probably, as much as me and you would probably think that Barack Obama, should be locked up for war crimes and would not pull punches on how terrible of a president he was, but we could both kind of acknowledge that campaign in 2008, there was something very beautiful about it, and a lot of the things that he ran on, we probably would still agree with. But for people on the left, and when I say the left, I mean like the left half of America, encompassing liberals and leftists, I think that was such a bitter pill to swallow, to ever accept that, like, oh, no, actually, this guy is just a continuation of the George W. Bush administration. It was almost like liberals would have to give up their cool black friend and give up their proof of how racist they're not. Because, look, I supported the first black president, and like, There was something psychological there that made it very hard for people to criticize Donald Trump and to criticize Barack Obama. And then Donald Trump, just by his very nature, triggered those people to such a level that there was no nuance to be had. There was no conversation where you could say, yes, I think he's a bad guy. Yes, I didn't love his comment about Mexicans, but also I don't just have to trust the CIA blindly. That just wasn't going to happen. And it was like, this guy has made me furious. Whoever is against him, I'm on board with them. And this affected, as you know very well, Glenn, this affected a huge percentage of liberals and leftists. And comedians were not above that. Comedians also fell into that. And then add on to that, all of the financial incentives were for them to kind of go down this path. It's been very sad, personally, for me to see. I mean, guys like Stephen Colbert, if you could go back and watch the old Colbert Report, it was so funny. The guy is so talented. And to see what he's been doing the last few years, it's like, it's a very weird feeling to see somebody you had previously respected for their craft, a craft that you have dedicated your life to and care about very much, to see them just like so pathetic and just grasping for approval from the powerful. So there's been a lot of that.
Yeah, so just pick up on your first point, which I absolutely take fully. In fact, I almost never will call New York Times or NBC News or anything like that the mainstream media, which is the term previously applied to them, exactly for that reason. I will only call them the corporate media, and in part it's exactly what you said, and I guess I should be a little more careful about doing this in other contexts as well, which is that obviously the number of people who watch Joe Rogan, or by the way, who listen to Tucker Carlson's podcast, is so much greater than the number of people who watch, quote unquote, the mainstream media, that at some point there is nothing mainstream about them. And you see the fact that how often they insist on certain ideas end up being rejected by the American people who actually don't see them as mainstream. All right, let me just ask you another question about, I kind of was talking about this sort of, let's call it the glorified history. One of the things that Colbert did that I love the most is when he gave that 2006 White House Correspondents' Dinner address, and I mean, it was vicious, but also like incredibly subtle as extremely incisive parody. And he was mocking the media to their face at their big event, and they really didn't know what to do about it because it took them a while to understand that it wasn't George Bush, but they who were the targets of it. And obviously it would be impossible to imagine Colbert doing anything like that. I think sometimes comedy is a little bit, it's not really timeless. If you go back and try and watch like Oliver and Hardy or the Marx Brothers or even Lenny Bruce, which I've tried doing, it's very difficult because of the cultural difference to really connect to a lot of the comedy. But I think George Carlin is an exception where, you know, his clips often go viral because they resonate as much today. So let me just play a quick clip of Carlin, which I'm sure you've heard before, just to illustrate the point I want to make and then ask you about. That clip is on its way.
But listen, you
There it
told
is.
me I should apologize. So
No,
what
this
do you
is
think
not
I
it.
should apologize for? And then I'll tell you what I think you should apologize.
George Carlin
I
looks
know
young.
I should apologize for.
It's two George
Obviously,
Carlins.
there was-
So that was not the George Carlin clip. Do we have the George Carlin clip? Okay, rather than spending a lot of time on that, let me, if we get it, we'll get it, and I'll actually show it after I make the point, which is,
Was it the Vietnam War
no,
joke?
it was the one
Is that what
about,
you're talking about?
there was the one about it's a tiny little club and you're not in it. And it was this like massive denunciation of establishment dogma and establishment power and talking about politics, not as right versus left or Democrats versus Republicans, but against the tiny number of elites who run the country constantly, not only indifferent to, but purposely at the expense of essentially everybody else. And then, you know, it used to be that late night TV was one of the most watched things ever. I mean, Johnny Carson was, was must-watch TV for everybody. And if you look at the ratings now of these late night hosts, including Jimmy Fallon on The Tonight Show or Jimmy Kimmel or Stephen Colbert, oftentimes Greg Gutfeld is the #1 most watched late night comedy host on TV. He's at Fox because the rest of them sound exactly alike and are constantly dividing the liberal audience. Why has this happened? I mean, I have a view that pretty much every institution and every sector of our culture got completely contaminated by this idea that every last thing should be about destroying Trump, and that once that infects journalism, once that infects comedy, it destroys it all. But what is your view about why there's so many of those major comics that have a lot of freedom and yet are so lame in what they do?
Well, I agree with you. First of all, I do think it was something about Donald Trump. I think that whether for right or wrong, and there's probably a mix of both of those, the culture had been so primed to hate someone like Donald Trump. And that's also part of the reason why Donald Trump took off in a way that, I mean, I don't know about you, but I certainly didn't think he ever was going to. I mean, like, from my perspective, I'll fully admit I've gotten some predictions right. But when Donald Trump first came down the escalators and when he started running for president, I did not think this was actually going to take off and he was actually going to win. But part of the reason I think why he did win is because it was like, just on a fundamental level, on something that Donald Trump couldn't have even himself planned, he was like the perfect antidote to wokeism, the perfect antidote to political correctness on every level. I mean, here is a straight, white, rich guy who doesn't care at all about being insensitive. And in fact, he kicked off his presidential campaign by saying, you know, these Mexicans coming over here, they ain't so great, you know, and so in a sense, he appealed so much to everyone who was fed up with the cultural norms, but for everybody who was embedded in them, or perhaps even really benefiting from them, he was everything that they were programmed to hate. You know, like, and it just like they all spazzed out. And then, of course, that's just explaining how people felt about it. But then on top of that, he was also saying things like, we're going to drain the swamp and we're going to end the wars. And, you know, George W. Bush lied us into the war in Iraq, and Obama created ISIS. And, you know, like, as you know, Glenn, okay, George W. Bush did lie us into the war in Iraq. Obama created ISIS might be a little bit of a stretch, but there's some truth to it. Like, maybe not create, but he certainly did arm and fund them intentionally. And so there was just a lot of this mixture where he totally triggered anyone with somewhat left-wing sensibilities, and then also scared the bejesus out of the powerful. And so now you had this weird marriage of the very powerful being on a mission to destroy this guy. And then a lot of these guys who we're talking about, they had found themselves in very cushy positions. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm sure you have too, is that for most regular people, you kind of imagine that, like, you know, most people can't even fathom what it would be like to get a contract where you get $10 million or something like that. And you're just like, oh, wow, you're set for life. And most people imagine, as I do, that if you were in that situation, one of the benefits would be, well, now you can just say whatever you want to. I mean, you don't have to worry about anything. You don't have to have bosses anymore. You don't have to care about showing up to something you don't want to. You don't have to care about someone not wanting you to say something you don't want to say, because come on, you're set for life now. The reality, as I've observed, tends to be that human beings are social, psychological creatures. And once they get into the cool club, the exclusive club, they want to fight to maintain their status in that. And you see this with Howard Stern and Jimmy Kimmel and like all these guys who used to be these guys who loved to, like, you know,
be transgressive, say things they weren't supposed to say that were offensive to people.
Yes, and now they're desperate to not do that. In fact, they have far less freedom than they did when they had much less wealth and influence. So I think that's a huge part of it too. And it's, you know, I don't completely understand it, but I do find it fascinating to watch. And there's no question that whatever exactly what the psychological dynamic that created this, there's no question that this is where they went. All of these guys totally sacrificed their artistic integrity and just their integrity, period, to try to stay in that club. And they're still doing it every night.
Yeah, and the reward Jimmy Kimmel got and gets is evident by what he just did, which was he was the star host of this massive Democratic Party Hollywood fundraiser where Barack Obama and Joe Biden were jointly interviewed, and the person who got to interview them was Jimmy Kimmel, because they, of course, know that he is a hardcore partisan Democrat who will never criticize Joe Biden or Barack Obama, and yet always says the thing you hear on every other channel about Donald Trump. So is that something that you think has happened? That I think one of the most important points in journalism is that because journalism has become so corporatized, big corporation controls almost every major media outlet, and therefore it imposes the corporate ethos on people that you have to conform, that you can't anger power centers. I wonder if you think that explains what is happening in that level or that sector of comedy.
Well, I think that, first off, it's just hearing that. I mean, I believe that was George Carlin's final bit. I believe that was his
like
closing
2008,
bit on the
I think. 2008, I think, is when he died. 2009 or something, and this was maybe a year before.
Yeah, but I believe this was his last.
Sorry, 2005.
Like,
I
believe that was
2005.
Sure. So, like, but that was the closer. And it was also like, you know, as a comedian, I think George Carlin had kind of earned the moment to just have this scathing rant. You know, he's had much funnier bits than that, but that was like an amazing rant. And I don't know. I think that a lot of these guys, look, they got offered ginormous sums of money. And so I'm sure that's a big part of why they have just gone along to get along. I remember, so I don't know if you know this, Glenn, but for a year in 2017, I worked technically for CNN, or technically for Turner. And I was a contributor on Essie Cupp's show, which was called Unfiltered. And they really brought me on board because, like, they were like, oh, Dave's like a comedian who does political jokes and he'll be funny. And I think they had no idea what they were getting with me. And then it was very cool for me at the time. I got a lot of like viral clips of me and Essie Cupp like really battling. At the time, the topics were about, like, you know, whether we should have a regime change war in Syria, or is Donald Trump a Russian spy and stuff like this, you know, ridiculous things like that. But at the time that I was around CNN, and I very briefly met, you know, like Brian Stelter and Don Lemon and even Chris Cuomo, before debating him. I met him there. And one of the things that was really interesting to me, and maybe you've had some experience with this, I'm not sure, but one of the things is I would kind of like observe these people, and they were very big on like, you kind of like walk into the green room, and it'd be like Don Lemon would walk in there, and he'd kind of be like, just got off the phone with Dick Cheney's chief of staff, and he said blah, blah, blah about what's going on in Syria. Just spoke to the number 3 guy at the Defense Department, and he said blah. And they're kind of like, you can tell that they were very like enamored with being close to power. And I get that. I think there's something like deep rooted in human beings, because we're tribal creatures. Like there's something where it's like, hey, I just talked to like the 3rd to highest ape in our little ape kingdom, and he's told me I matter and I'm somebody who's actually important. And, I think there's something very intoxicating about getting close to the ring of power, or being in these circles and going to the cocktail parties with people who are important. And I think that it comes down to almost like a personality quality, a matter of how much integrity as a person you actually have, how far that could be tested. And I'm not trying to say like I'm better than anyone. Maybe I've just never been tested in that way. Maybe I would fail the test if put in that position. But I do think that while I believe, and I'm not sure I'm right about this, but I believe when they were 20 or 25, I believe that if you played that clip of George Carlin for Stephen Colbert or for, Jimmy Kimmel or one of these guys, I think they would have gone, that's awesome. I think there was a time when they would have been like, man, that's so cool. But as their lives progressed, they went, I guess I'll just take $50 million instead of being that guy. That's my honest assessment of it.
Yeah, absolutely. If someone asked me what has been the most important part of your journalism career, I would say that I have not lived and chose not to live in that corridor between New York and Washington. As a result, my social standing, the people who are around me who perceive me has never depended on entrance into that group. And I would also say that, when I entered journalism, my idea of journalism, this kind of iconic journalist, was somebody who was constitutionally composed to want to throw rocks at the places and the palaces where those kind of people gathered, not try and find their way into them. And again, I think that the corporatization of media, which encourages and rewards people who integrate into power centers, is what has turned journalists that way. But I think what you described is exactly not only one of the main problems, but I would argue with the main problem, because what it ends up doing is it takes the field of reporters and journalism, which as its core is supposed to be adversarial to those people who are running the country and all of that, and it fuses them so that our media has become spokesmen for those people, because those are the friends and the people that they want to aggrandize, exactly so that Don Lemon can come out when you're around and say, oh, guess who I just talked to? The second ranking member of the Pentagon. But he won't be able to do that if he gets their secret documents and exposes them all over the world. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.